When an avoidant pushes you away, it's easy to assume they don't care. The silence, the withdrawal, the emotional distance, it feels like rejection. But the truth is often the opposite. Many times that distance is not a sign of indifference, it's a signal of fear. Avoidant individuals tend to retreat not because they lack love, but because the experience of love makes them feel profoundly vulnerable. Love for them is not simple or relaxing, it's overwhelming. It triggers a deep, unconscious fear of loss, dependence, or being seen in ways they're not prepared for. Their instinctive response is to create emotional distance to feel safe. This withdrawal is a defense mechanism, and it's often learned in childhood or earlier experiences. People who develop an avoidant attachment style usually grew up in environments where emotional expression was unsafe, minimized, or met with judgment. They learn to survive by relying on themselves, by shutting down emotions rather than risking connection that might not be reciprocated or might end in pain. So, as adults, even when they fall deeply in love, they might not show it in the ways that seem familiar or comfortable to others. Instead of leaning in, they back away. Instead of expressing affection, they hide. And ironically, they tend to do this most intensely when the feelings are strongest. To the person on the receiving end, this can be deeply confusing. You might think, if they love me, why are they pulling away? But from the avoidance perspective, this pullback is a way to cope with emotional overload. It's not that they don't feel deeply, they do. In fact, their love may be so intense that it scares them. It threatens their sense of independence, their emotional control, and their need for self-protection. The more they care, the more exposed they feel, and the more they fear being hurt. So they create distance, hoping that space will bring relief. But in doing so, they also unintentionally hurt the person they love most. Recognizing this dynamic can transform how we relate to avoidant partners or loved ones. Rather than taking the distance personally, we can start to understand it as a form of emotional self-preservation. It doesn't mean there is no love. It often means the love is so real, so intense, that it overwhelms the person experiencing it. And understanding that can shift us out of blame and into empathy. It doesn't mean we should accept unhealthy behavior or deny our own needs, but it does help us see the situation more clearly. The avoidance isn't a lack of love. It might be the deepest expression of it, just filtered through fear and old pain. That's why when an avoidant pushes you away, they might actually love you the most. Love is one of the most powerful forces in the human experience, and because of that, it has the potential to awaken our deepest wounds. For someone with avoidant tendencies, the closer they get to another person, the more their unresolved pain begins to surface. Intimacy can feel threatening because it requires openness, vulnerability, and emotional presence. All things that may not have felt safe in their earlier life. This is why love, rather than being purely joyful or comforting, can sometimes feel terrifying. It exposes the parts of us we've spent years protecting or hiding, especially the parts that were hurt, dismissed, or misunderstood in the past. Avoidant individuals often carry emotional patterns from childhood or early relationships where expressing needs led to rejection, criticism, or neglect. As a result, they learn to disconnect from those needs and to avoid emotional closeness. But when real love shows up, when someone sees them, cares for them, and wants to be close, those old emotional patterns begin to unravel. Love doesn't just give warmth, it acts like a mirror. It reflects all the unhealed parts back to us, not to shame or punish, but to offer a path toward healing. And this is why love, while beautiful, can also be incredibly uncomfortable for someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding emotional exposure. In Tony Robbins' teachings, growth is a central theme. He says we grow the most when we are challenged the most. And intimate relationships challenge us more deeply than almost anything else. They test our beliefs, our fears, and our capacity to remain open in the face of emotional risk. For an avoidant, love may feel like a battlefield between the desire to connect and the impulse to protect. But it's in this internal struggle that the potential for transformation lies. Love doesn't just hurt. It reveals what still needs to be healed. And this revelation is not a curse, it's a gift. If approached with awareness and compassion, it becomes an invitation to grow beyond fear. Love, when met with intention and patience, can help an avoidant slowly dismantle the emotional walls they've built. The presence of a safe, consistent, and understanding partner can create the space where healing becomes possible. But this isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. The journey often looks like one step forward and two steps back. Moments of closeness followed by sudden withdrawal, but underneath the turbulence is a soul reaching out hesitant, unsure, but craving connection. Understanding this dynamic changes how we interpret emotional distance. Instead of labeling it as rejection or detachment, we can start to see it as a symptom of love meeting fear. And fear, when brought into the light, can be worked with, it can be softened, it can be healed. That's the paradox. Love brings up fear not to destroy the relationship, but to bring it to a deeper level of truth. It's through this process that both people grow not just as a couple, but as individuals. And in the case of an avoidant, the presence of real love may feel like chaos at first, but it's also the very thing that has the power to lead them back to wholeness. Avoidant individuals often confuse those around them because they appear emotionally detached or uninterested, yet deep down, they crave connection like everyone else. The desire to be loved, understood, and accepted is universal. It's a fundamental human need. What sets the avoidant apart isn't the absence of that desire, but the way they manage it. They crave closeness, but the moment that closeness starts to feel overwhelming or threatens their sense of control, they instinctively back away. For them, connection isn't something that comes naturally. It's something they attempt to regulate on their own terms, in doses they feel they can handle. This behavior isn't random or heartless. It's often rooted in their core emotional wiring, developed from earlier life experiences where closeness may have come with conditions, expectations, or even pain. As a result, their nervous system can be wired to perceive intimacy as a risk rather than a reward. So while they may deeply care about someone, their behavior often contradicts that care. They might avoid phone calls, dodge serious conversations, or physically distance themselves not because they don't want connection, but because they fear being consumed by it. The irony is that the more they value the relationship, the more pressure they feel, and the more likely they are to retreat. Understanding this pattern requires shifting our perception of emotional needs. According to Tony Robbins, all human behavior is driven by the need to meet 6 core needs: certainty, variety, significance, love/connection, growth, and contribution. The avoidant person still needs love and connection, but they try to fulfill that need while simultaneously meeting their other needs, especially certainty and significance, by staying in control and limiting vulnerability. Their distancing behavior is often an unconscious strategy to feel emotionally safe and self-reliant. Because they associate vulnerability with discomfort, they may connect through actions rather than words. They might show love by doing something practical or being physically present without expressing much emotion. To them, this feels like a safe way to show they care without exposing themselves to rejection or emotional overwhelm. But if their partner interprets emotional distance as disinterest, the avoidant may feel misunderstood and even more withdrawn, reinforcing the very cycle they're stuck in. This is why communication with an avoidant person can feel so confusing. You may feel like you're constantly being pulled in and then pushed away. You sense the connection, but then it vanishes when things get too intimate. It's not manipulation, it's a survival pattern. The avoidant is trying to get close without losing themselves in the process. They're navigating love with a cautious hand, trying to protect their independence and emotional boundaries while also meeting their need for connection. What they often need is not pressure to open up faster, but the safety and trust to open up at their own pace. When they feel they have the space to be themselves without being forced to explain or justify their feelings, they're more likely to begin showing up more consistently. They need room to breathe emotionally and paradoxically. It's often when they're given that space that they feel safest drawing closer. So while it may appear that they don't care or want connection, the truth is they do. But they need to approach it on their terms in a way that doesn't trigger their fear of losing control or being emotionally flooded. Patience and understanding can go a long way in building a bridge to someone who has learned to keep love at arm's length. When someone with an avoidant attachment style pulls away, it often stirs up intense emotional reactions in their partner, feelings of confusion, abandonment, rejection, and even anger. It's natural to want to confront that distance or withdraw in response, either to protect yourself or to send a message. If you're pulling away, then I will too. But this reaction, although completely understandable, can actually reinforce the avoidant person's deepest fears. Their internal story is often shaped by the belief that closeness leads to pain, that vulnerability will eventually result in loss, rejection, or disappointment. So when they take a step back and their partner responds by also pulling away, criticizing, or expressing hurt in a way that feels attacking, it confirms their unconscious belief. Intimacy isn't safe. This creates a vicious cycle. The avoidant partner pulls away to protect themselves. Their partner feels hurt and responds with emotional reactivity or withdrawal of their own. And the avoidant internalizes that response as evidence that they were right to create distance in the first place. Over time, this pattern can destroy even a strong connection, not because of a lack of love, but because both people are trapped in self-protective behaviors that escalate rather than resolve emotional disconnection. What makes this dynamic even more challenging is that the avoidant person rarely communicates what's going on inside. They often don't say, "I'm feeling overwhelmed," or "I need some space because I'm afraid." Instead, they shut down, go quiet, or become emotionally distant. And the partner is left guessing, interpreting that silence as a sign of disinterest or emotional detachment. It's in this space of uncertainty that misunderstandings flourish, and it becomes easy to take things personally. But if we can begin to understand the fear underneath the avoidance, we open the door to more conscious, compassionate responses. When you respond to an avoidance withdrawal with judgment, anger, or your own version of retreat, it's like throwing fuel on the fire. It deepens their sense that closeness leads to discomfort, that being vulnerable with another person is dangerous. Instead of feeling safe to reconnect, they feel even more compelled to stay at a distance. But when you meet that distance with patience, calm, and clarity, something powerful happens. You interrupt the cycle, you offer a new emotional experience, one where space doesn't automatically lead to loss and where connection doesn't require pressure or emotional chaos. This doesn't mean you ignore your own needs or allow someone to repeatedly shut you out without accountability. It means learning to stay grounded in your own emotional truth, while also recognizing the fears that are driving their behavior. You can validate their need for space while still expressing your desire for closeness. You can be firm in your boundaries without becoming emotionally reactive. And most importantly, you can show them that love doesn't have to equal control, pressure, or judgment. Responding this way takes emotional maturity, self-awareness, and often a lot of inner work. It's not about tolerating harmful behavior. It's about choosing responses that break the cycle instead of feeding it. Over time, when an avoidant person sees that their need for space isn't punished, and that someone can stay emotionally present without overwhelming them, it begins to shift their internal wiring. They start to associate intimacy with safety instead of threat, and that is where real healing begins, not just for the avoidant, but for the relationship as a whole. Loving someone who is avoidant requires a different kind of strength, one that's grounded in both empathy and self-respect. It asks you to hold space for someone else's emotional limitations without losing sight of your own needs. It's tempting to try to change them, to pull them closer, to fix the gap between you. But the truth is, real love begins when we stop trying to mold people into who we want them to be, and instead learn to meet them where they are. This doesn't mean settling for less than we deserve. It means understanding the difference between unconditional love and unrealistic expectations. Avoidant individuals often don't express love in the traditional or expected ways. They may not verbalize affection, crave constant connection, or offer emotional validation on demand. But this doesn't mean they don't feel deeply. Their love might be quiet, guarded, or indirect, but it can be real. The key is learning to recognize the difference between someone who is unwilling to grow and someone who is trying, slowly, in their own way, to meet you where they can. Meeting them where they are doesn't mean you abandon your emotional needs. It means you listen with more curiosity than criticism. You observe their patterns not to excuse them, but to understand the emotional architecture behind their behavior. Tony Robbins often says that all suffering comes from expectations that don't match reality. If you expect an avoidant person to suddenly become highly expressive, emotionally available, and comfortable with constant closeness, you set yourself up for repeated disappointment. But if you can accept where they are emotionally while remaining anchored in your own truth, you give the relationship a better chance to grow from a foundation of mutual respect instead of pressure. Love becomes less about changing the other person and more about navigating the space between you with honesty, compassion, and patience. This doesn't mean you deny your own desires. You still have every right to want connection, openness, and emotional presence. What shifts is your approach. Instead of demanding or pushing, you invite. You express your needs clearly without making them conditions for love. You show that you can hold space for someone else's fears while also honoring your own boundaries. This balance is difficult, but it's essential. Because the goal isn't to force someone to meet your needs out of fear of losing you. It's to create a space where both people can show up as they are and grow from there. It's also important to recognize when your love becomes self-sacrificing. Meeting someone where they are is only healthy when you're not constantly abandoning yourself in the process. If you find that your emotional needs are consistently unmet, that the relationship is one-sided, or that you're shrinking to keep the peace, that's not love, that's survival. There's a difference between patience and self-neglect. Real love, the kind that leads to growth and healing, requires truth from both people. Ultimately, choosing to love someone who struggles with intimacy means choosing to be a mirror and a guide, not a savior. You reflect their worth even when they can't see it, and you guide by example, showing what secure connection looks and feels like. In doing so, you help them experience a version of love that doesn't demand perfection, but welcomes authenticity. And that kind of love can be transformative. It doesn't force change. It inspires it. It doesn't push someone past their limits. It walks beside them until they're ready to take the next step. That's the power of real love. Not trying to rewrite someone's story, but offering a safe space for them to write a new chapter, if they're willing.